Have a fun video you'd like to see featured on NCW Life? Email us at newsphotos@ncwlife.com.
Welcome once again to Let's Learn here on the NCW Life channel. I'm your host, Eric Granstrom, and on this series of Let's Learn, we're talking about death. It's a conversation that nobody wants to talk about, but one that's coming for us all, and I thought it would be a prime opportunity here on Let's Learn to talk about death and dying and have a conversation. And on this particular episode, we're focusing in on the funeral home. And to join us to talk about that, we have the owner, the funeral director, and embalmer for Heritage Memorial Chapel in East Wenatchee, Jeffrey Wilson. Jeffrey, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you. It's my honor.
We've gone the whole gambit here on death and dying in this conversation, and we spoke on the phone here a while back. And thank you, first of all, for agreeing to come in and have this conversation. It seems that everybody wants to stay away from it. Nobody wants to talk about it. Yet it's the inevitable for us all, and I thought at least if during the show we could encourage people to have the talk about what they want, then that would help for when they end up in your office down the road.
It's very helpful. I came to funeral service out of curiosity. When I was 9 years old, my grandmother passed away rather suddenly, and my own family, on my mother's side, my mom, my aunts, uncles, everyone, it was like they were the only survivors of an earthquake. And as I watched that process, I was like, well, how does this work? And my cousin and I both, we were the youngest of all the cousins, so we would talk to each other about, what have you learned about this death thing? Well, neither one of us learned anything. And you don't talk to your friends about death when you turn about 13. They just don't want to talk about it. So we didn't. And we both ended up working at funeral homes a week out of high school. I was going to be an auto mechanic on the waiting list at Spokane Community College. And when I went to do it after being at the funeral home for about 3 months, I couldn't. And I don't know why. It seemed like a religious thing to me that I needed to go on to mortuary school, and I did. But I always thought I'd get my questions answered when I first went to work there, and I didn't. I actually didn't in mortuary school either, and I got my questions answered later through a pastor that lost his wife in Moses Lake suddenly. So I could have been an auto mechanic, but all my friends that are said you wouldn't want to do that,
right.
You know.
So what was the question and what was the answer?
Well, the question was, why did they have this reaction? And the reaction, it was a shock reaction. But not only a shock reaction, but it would keep coming. They would go in this, like a click out and be in like a daydream state, you know. And in mortuary, they call that denial. In that stage. Well, there's a segment that's denial, but technically we want to call it God's anesthesia. So we have to bring Christianity kind of back into that to understand that this is a built-in mechanism when we've had enough of the grief process and we get our pendulum stuck, is what I say. We have a built-in set of breaker points that say, okay, you've had enough, you're going to go into daydream neutral. I call it timeout for a little while. And then when your timeout's done, you click back into normal swing and you realize, because you can do automatic things like drive a car. When you get to where you're going, you turn the key off and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I don't remember driving. And those things happen to people after death occurs. And my mom was really into that, my aunts. So I thought, what is that? Well, mortuary school, they call it mortuary science. And they have to, because one of our classes was funeral service sociology. And funeral service sociology is the study of all the different denominations. Obviously, there's a large percentage, larger than people probably realize, that don't believe in God. They believe in other entity or whatever, but you can't really use that. So when they say denial, they're including everyone. But denial doesn't work. When you tell someone that they're doing that, oh, well, you're in denial. Well, I use myself as the example. If I'm 4 years old and my mom says you're denying that, pointing her finger at me, it doesn't mean I was doing it right. It simply stated means that you're doing it wrong and you're not telling the truth about it.
Sure.
That's not what these people are doing. They are in automatic mind saving that God's granted us, and that's one of the big things I learned. So
I imagine in that state, then that's got to be the most difficult time to try to make any kind of a decision regarding services, regarding making plans
Absolutely.
and everything else.
Yeah, that's the most difficult thing, especially in a sudden death, to have someone come right in and try to talk to you. We like to have more than one person there during that process because they're not going to remember a lot of it. So one of the things you alluded to is that it's important to understand that by having plans known, whether you do anything in writing or not, at least let your family members know what your wishes might be if something were to happen. That helps them so much because they have a roadmap, so to speak. So oftentimes what you'll find is, I'm going to use my mom as the example, her generation, don't talk about death. That was one of the things that World War II kind of brought to us. We put our head in the sand. We don't talk about death. So to get those people to actually talk about what they want is very difficult. But if they have a spouse that passes and the family makes that arrangement, oftentimes that becomes a roadmap for when the second spouse passes away. You get that file out and you have a roadmap that helps them through that. So.
One of the conversations I was having with a hospice nurse from Confluence Health, she was saying that she wished that we could eliminate the term death from this whole lexicon, because it's really about a celebration of life,
right,
not about the actual death, because that is actually a very small, I mean, that window is you're alive and you're dead and then that's it. Yeah. And then it's the celebration of that person, that human, that roamed this earth and what they meant to us.
Right.
And that was her perspective, and I thought that was very interesting.
That is interesting. I don't think we're going to get away from it because biblically it goes back to what I'm going to call the first funeral director. That had to be Adam, because his own son was murdered, and here they were faced with, and so we hear oftentimes that, hey, you guys weren't the very first profession, you know what the first profession is, and they start laughing, and we go, well, biblically, if you go back far enough and you believe that, then death is the oldest profession, death care. So I don't think you can get away from that word. However, I go back in funeral service now 42 years. I started in 1975, and in that time frame, the funeral homes were all geared to make you have to cry. And there's a reason for that. The reason came out years later, and I thought it was a joke. There was a grant-funded university study to determine whether we release more endorphins when we laugh or when we cry. And I thought, well, that's a stupid waste of money. Obviously, it's when we laugh.
Right.
It's not. It's when we cry.
Interesting.
But if you go back to that time frame of funeral service, when you came into the funeral home, you were already not wanting to be there.
Right.
And they would take you down with dirge music, dim lighting, you have to see the body in the casket, or go by the casket, even the organ music, everything would just geared to make you have to cry.
Right.
And I can remember senior funeral directors in those days saying, well, that person over there that came in might well need some grief counseling later on because they didn't cry. Well, is that really true? No, because today what we do is if you come in to the funeral home and you're coming to a service, I'm going to pick on chaplain at the hospital, they're going to want to depict from the family. They meet with the family and get information, and they're going to want some of the stories that are a little bit lighter sided, clean stories, but that they can bring them above the line they came in the door with a little bit of laughter. Now, obviously, it takes more laughter to equal the endorphins you get from tears, but you're going to be above the line that you came in. That's the celebrative side, versus the way we used to do it before. If we take you down here to make you cry, you're never going to make it to the line you walked in the door at, and that was the big thing about funeral service.
Very interesting. I want to back up a little bit and kind of take a wider scope about the difference between a funeral home and a mortuary and embalming. That's part of your title, so I wanted to ask you more about that. So hang on, we're going to take a quick break and come back with Jeffrey Wilson from Heritage Memorial Chapel. It's Let's Learn on the NCW Life channel. We'll be back with more right after this.
Is your vehicle in need of a quick oil change or tune-up before hitting the road this summer? Stop by Quick Lube and Tune, the home of the good guys at 610 South Wenatchee Avenue.
Welcome back to Let's Learn here on the NCW Life Channel in our series of Death and Dying, a conversation. And today we're focusing in on the funeral home. And joining us to have that conversation is Jeffrey Wilson, who's the owner of Heritage Memorial Chapel. He's also the funeral director and embalmer. And you were talking about your path to get to that direction. I wanted to ask you the difference between a funeral home and a mortuary. That was the conversation. I think I remember first hearing that conversation. Well, we're going to go down to the mortuary. Right. Is there a difference?
Well, mortuary is an old term, and when you get a envision of a old castle-like building that's more the epitome of creepy today. A funeral home today is a little bit more modernistic. It takes the place of a church. So you have a chapel in there, and the chapel is considered to be non-denominational for those people that feel like they don't want to have the religion pushed on them. They can do more of the celebration of life gathering and whatnot. Funeral home is also, it can or doesn't have to, if it's associated with another funeral home or a mortuary, it may or may not have embalming facilities on site. It may be just a chapel and arrangement offices. So there are some differences there that go back historically. Not every funeral home does have the facilities for embalming.
Okay. So what is embalming? What is that process?
That's a beautiful question that kind of got me involved with this to begin with, because that was one of my questions too, and I never got it answered properly. Embalming is actually a process of preservation that we've done since the Civil War era of time. During the Civil War, they tried to be able to have the high-ranking officers from the North be taken from battlefield to burial in their own burial grounds, and they couldn't do it properly because of not having any way to preserve. So there was a actual medical doctor that came up with the idea of embalming. So embalming uses predominantly formaldehyde, glutaraldehydes, and dialdehydes, which are ester ketones, which are similar product but offer different properties for firming tissue that would be proteins. So what actually takes place is a operation that involves replacing the heart with an embalming machine that's a pump. And the pump has pressure and flow control, it even has pulse. When you raise an artery, that would be the same thing as when you're pumping blood from the heart through the capillaries to feed the muscle tissues and then being returned on the venous side. So what we do is actually replace that heart, that pump, with the embalming machine, and you raise an artery and a vein, and you inject the fluid of mixture of different things that are like water correctants, surfactants, which are make things like slippery, like a soapy, things that are blood dissolvers and things like that, and what they call a co-injection. Those kind of things with formaldehyde to flush the system out, because without flushing it, you begin to turn dark purple and whatnot, like those kind of things, and it doesn't take as long as people think to do those things. So,
and that was my question too, and I want you to finish that answer. How long do you have? So a person passes away, you have the body. How long do you have before you need to start doing, if this is, you know, you're going to do a graveside, you're going to bury them, how long do you have?
Well, there's two questions really there. Let me go back to the other one first really quick. So we inject in the arterial side, and you raise the vein and you drain off the pressure on the venous side. And so you're just replacing that. So that creates embalming. And embalming was prevalent up until really the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, we had a beginning of a change towards not having as many burials but more cremation, and we would have refrigeration instead. So your two-part question goes like this. One is, what is the law requirement of us? And so the law says that we must embalm or refrigerate within 24 hours. And so if you're not having viewing or visitation, you're having cremation and whatnot like that, then you're going to probably be looking towards refrigeration. Embalming is for if you are having viewing and visitation and you're having a longer period of stay. Now what we've determined or found out, I guess it's a matter of I'm going to call it osmotic learning, is that if we have embalming done and we want to extend how long before we have that burial service, let's say we're going 7 to 10 days out, then we can do refrigeration as well as the embalming.
Okay.
And what refrigeration does is pretty much keep the person that's embalmed just that way. We don't have the same problems if we're out waiting 3 days out and it used to be that you would bring the casket and body to their home in the parlor. The reason they called
Right.
it the parlor.
Right.
So you'd have dehydration problems, different cosmetic problems, those kind of things involved when we don't. So we've actually held quite some time for people that way.
The fascinating part of that is there's an expectation, I guess, for the deceased to look as most lifelike as possible. Is that correct?
Yes, always.
So
Yeah.
the embalming part of it, but there's also other parts of that too, especially if, as far as makeup and things like that. Are there cosmeticians that are in this field of
Well,
work too?
that's part of what we do too. One of the classes is restorative art. And restorative art really focuses on here up. That's a 1-year class. And so if you have a person that's had trauma, then you can restore them. Obviously, there's certain times when we can't, and we have to tell people that. Occasionally, if there's that much trauma, then they can do things like see hands or feet or something else that makes them realize that this is the person we're talking about. And
Sure.
that gives them a little bit more of comfort to understand. But
We're just breaking the surface here on this conversation. I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll talk more about the specifics of handling of the deceased as we come back with Jeffrey Wilson here with Heritage Memorial Chapel on Let's Learn on the NCW Life channel.
Please join us weekly for the 12th District with yours truly, Kerry Condata. Check your channel guide for times or go to ncwlife.com for details.
Welcome back to Let's Learn here on the NCW Life channel. In our series on death and dying, a conversation, we're talking about the funeral home today with Jeffrey Wilson of Heritage Memorial Chapel. And Jeffrey was sharing the information about dealing with the body once the person has passed. So I had Wayne Harris in, the coroner for Chelan County,
Right.
and had him talk about the mortuary or the morgue, excuse me,
Right.
and about the death certificate and things like that. Talk about, from your perspective, once you get the call, someone has passed, and the arrangements are through Heritage. What's that process?
There's two processes. One is, first thing we're going to do is go look to see if they'd actually made some arrangements. They call pre-arrangements in advance, giving us the information. Part of the reason why that is so important is because it is electronic death registration today. And so the information that's the most important is the vital statistics. So it's like where you were born, when you were born, your parents' names, mother's maiden name, social security number, your occupation, your schooling, all those sorts of things. If we have those, we can input that right away into the EDRS system, and then that gets the death certificate started with doctor or the coroner to expedite the process of disposition, whether it be burial, cremation, entombment, whatever it's going to be. Sometimes it's ship out to another state. That makes it more important yet. So if we have that, that clarifies at least 1 day. It's like 1 day in advance of time. That's very important because our health department system is closed on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, always now. And if you run into a holiday, it's closed that next day. So you can't do anything with that body through those time frames.
Oh, wow.
So if you have the information in advance, that's huge. Obviously, we get in touch with the family, and if it's at a home, we make an appointment right there with them about what we're going to be doing when we get back and when we can get together to visit with them. So if they don't have pre-arrangements, obviously we're starting with, we need to know that information for the state. That's primary to get in that information first. And then begin the processes of what are we doing about the obituary is very important because it is a story of that person's life. It's the beginning of the celebration of what we got. And it's oftentimes things that friends don't know. Because you may have met that person 10 years ago, but 60 years ago you didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
So that makes a big difference for people. And we have a website that we put that on first before it actually gets to the newspaper, so there's some play with those kind of things. And then making the arrangement for when and where services, what type of services. And sometimes people have celebration of life gathering or family gatherings that would be more like an outdoor barbecue than, or out at one of the shelters to celebrate that person versus in a structured facility, chapel or church.
Are you seeing a trend more along those lines? I mean, you've been in this business a long time now.
Yes and no. Yeah, the trend, the difference in the trend is with the advent of more cremation, we have more liquidity of what we can do timing-wise and where. Because you can't take a casket into a shelter out at Walla Walla Point Park. That's not proper for everybody else. And if you opened it, it'd be really improper for everybody that's walking by. But you can take an urn and you can celebrate that person's life out there and those kind of things. So that makes a difference, big difference. Yeah, it's pretty huge.
You know, you were mentioning when we first started about the reaction to death is either tears or in some cases laughter. Media tends to go one way or the other. They typically kind of poke fun at death because we don't want to talk about it, so let's make fun of it.
We don't want to talk about it.
So in reference to a body, the movie Little Miss Sunshine comes to mind, the movie Family Vacation, where somebody dies on a trip, they stick them in the car, you know, and then it's when they're getting to where they're going. Legally, that can't happen, can it?
Legally, that's not supposed to happen.
Okay.
No, where the death occurs is where that documentation has to take place. So if it's a sudden death that's unexpected, you need to call the authorities, whether it be Sheriff's Department, State Patrol, or Police Department, and then they'll get in touch with proper authorities, which would be Coroner's Office, Medical Examiner's Office, to determine whether this is okay, not okay, et cetera. You can call the funeral home, but the funeral home has to clarify that we're calling these authorities and let you know that we're calling the authorities.
Sure.
So as an example, that happens to us if a person is at home, even if they have palliative care, but they're not on hospice yet because they're not quite expected to make that stair step down and they pass away, then they call us and say, well, they're not on hospice yet. We have to ask those questions. They're not on hospice yet. Then you have to call whatever authority it is in that county to come investigate first. That would be Police Department, Sheriff's Department most commonly, and then they clarify, you know, with the coroner's office in that county when we can come.
So, I mean, that's a sign-off, basically, that has to happen first before you can come out?
Yeah, and unless they're on hospice. Hospice, the hospice nurse traditionally calls us and say this person's on hospice, and they give us the information, and then we go straight there. And then they notify the authority, of being the coroner's office, of the timing.
We're out of time already. See, I knew this was going to happen. Okay, we need to go, but we're going to come back with our next episode and continue this conversation with Jeffrey Wilson of Heritage Memorial Chapel on Let's Learn on the NCW Life Channel. Thanks for joining us.
For all the latest news in North Central Washington, go to ncwlife.com or find us on Facebook. Got a news tip? Email us at news@ncwlife.com or call 888-2020.